As many of you know, tracking your nutrition is one of the best ways to learn more about your food and exactly what it's made of when you're taking a closer look and objectively entering everything that you're eating, portion sizes, what the food is made of. You get a much better sense of what it's made up of. And when you can control that stuff, you're just in a better place to get results, learn more about that stuff. And if you're being coached, objectively, the coach having that information is it's just a game changer when it comes to making suggestions, not just on a you know meal by meal basis or even by like an ingredient to ingredient basis, but by like a big picture. Take a look at what your diet comprises of, and not just the specifics. Tracking your nutrition is amazing, but that doesn't mean that you need to be doing it forever. And that's what I want to talk about today: is how do we take people that should be tracking, get them closer to their food, what that looks like. And over time, as they get results, maybe start to pull out some of those components that are so numbers based and objective. And so I would say specific and focused to get them to a place where they can do things that are a bit more sustainable long term. There's pros and cons of everything, regardless of people tell you about the pros and cons. People don't need to track forever. And when done properly, they can still use tracking and what they're eating in a beneficial way to learn about the food, get a result, and then carry on the habits that they learn through the process of being more specific long term. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. If you're just getting started nutrition coaching and you want to, and you're maybe struggling with the next step to get this going, maybe you're the go-to person in your social circle. Everyone's always asking you questions. They know you're super into health and fitness. You got it figured out, but you don't necessarily know the first step to help them. You should also join my completely free 3-day challenge. I'll drop it in the chat here. If you are watching the replay, by all means, if you're watching the replay, it'll be in the description below. But for now, here is that actual link, and you guys should go check it out once we're done the live recording. If you guys have any questions as we go through things here, I do want to make these office hours, engaging and commentary. And if you have anything that comes up, by all means, this is the challenge right here. By all means, ask some questions and we'll go from there. But I really want to talk about this whole tracking thing. If you're not familiar with the process of tracking and how it differs from other approaches, like being more mindful when you eat and listening to your body, or following something extremely prescriptive like a meal plan, or which tells you exactly what to eat on a meal by meal basis, that should fall in line with your goals, but not always. Or something that's like more rules based, right? In order for me to be healthy, I need to avoid this or cut out this, or I'm only eating those things. A tracking based approach is different in the fact that typically we get a better sense of what someone wants to accomplish within, what the result that they're after, be it overall health, improving energy levels, but also maybe like a athletic performance, they're training for something, or weight loss, muscle gain, that type of thing. Get a better sense of what they need to be doing on an individual level based on how much energy they're burning, and then set a level of food that corresponds with that and prescribe a calorie number. And then within that calorie number, we start to assign macronutrient targets. Our macronutrient targets are always going to make up those calories because they're the large components of our food: protein, carbohydrates, and fat that supply the calories. But we'd set some macro targets as well. And then as someone eats, they track what they're eating towards those targets to reach a result. Most, the body of evidence in terms of science does show us that overall daily totals of calories and macronutrients are more important than what we do on a meal to meal basis and that type of thing. So when we have checks and balances around those big picture variables, it makes it really, really helpful and more effective to reach a result. Now, those are the pros of this stuff. If you're, tracking what you're eating and trying to reach those targets, Johnny says, who would you recommend for a client who is stubborn about tracking and refuses to? What kind of system? I would, number one, try to overcome the resistance of tracking would be the first thing, without a doubt. I think I talked about this today. It's having a conversation with them is like, first of all, they just don't know if it's completely necessary. But when you can explain it to them and position it as this is the best way for them to get results and to build habits that they'll have long term, they're more likely to do that stuff. And then just getting them doing some of it. It's like, well, yeah, no, I understand that you're a bit hesitant. Why don't we try it for a few weeks? This is what it'll look like. You'll get better, you'll improve, and chances are you'll start to see some of those results and you'll want to continue on. How does that sound? So instead of being like, avoid it entirely or abandon that plan, I would try to overcome it because it truly is in their best interest. From there, what we're going to teach you to do today is take them from this tracking based approach. And we think about the lifestyle of working with the client, life cycle, sorry, of working with a client. You go from um, tracking to maybe pulling out some of those tracking components, taking some days off, being more mindful eating, and focusing more on, you know, pretty much eating the same way without those targets, would be the most part, right? Like what happens if your tracking app goes down for a day? How would you eat? You'd eat probably pretty similarly. So we focus on that as well as just being more mindful of what's happening in terms of satiety, eating until mostly full, focusing on similar food choices, eating when hungry, eating around people, try not to be distracted, those type of things, balancing out our plates and the things that we're putting on our plates and making sure that we're covering our bases, doing that 3 square meals per day, maybe a couple of snacks, and trying to be more mindful so that it lines up with what we require and what we need to get a result. You can start people out on that, but I would just rather go through the process of, I think the best way to get there in my experience is to go through the steps of being a bit more mindful, or sorry, being a bit more on top of it through tracking at the beginning. But that's how I would approach that. Most people, when they do this, though, they feel like, oh man, I finally know what my food is made of and what I need and what I require. And I have a better sense of like what I need to do on a daily basis. And that type of experience does go a really, really long way. I'm trying not to sneeze right now. I don't know where the mute button is. 1 second. Back in business. But that's the kind of the intent around that in terms of getting people to see the importance of tracking. Now, what I like to do in terms of the life cycle of this stuff and how to get people away from tracking long term is we start to kind of think about it like, okay, people have a predetermined goal, and that's what they hire nutrition coaches, because I mean that's what makes the service so powerful, is that they have a place where they want to go. They have a place where they want to get to, right? So we get them going down that path, and using tracking under our supervision, making weekly adjustments and suggestions and setting some numbers that based on where they are and where they want to go, not just what the textbook says they should do. So we get to that place through, going through those steps. And then we start to pull out some elements of control. I think throughout that, we do always want to be measuring and in tune with hunger, both on like a global daily level, as well as on a meal to meal level. How hungry am I? What are my energy levels like? So we're not just relying on the numbers to say, you hit your numbers, now you can stop eating and that type of stuff. But from there, we want to start pulling out some levels of control. So, a vacation is a great time to start to practice some of those skills. Hey, you don't have a Wi-Fi signal anymore. How are you going to eat? Let's start to plan this stuff. Let's prioritize protein. Let's fill our plate with, a serving of vegetables and or fruit every time we eat. Let's aim to get this amount of protein at each meal. Let's not avoid anything, but let's be mindful of our hunger levels and when we're starting to feel full. And we can do this for 3 to 7 days and practice it out, and then get back to tracking when we're done. Or we can start to work in, off tracking days on a day on the weekend and plan this stuff in to get to a place where we're starting to pull out some of that control, where someone's getting closer to the result, their ultimate result that they want, or their ultimate goal, and they don't necessarily have to be so on throughout that process. We could go through it that way, right? And kind of go from there. So that would be one thing. And then from there, as they get closer to the goal, maybe we're pulling out doing more days like that and just uh, relying on mindful eating practices instead of being so prescriptive, to a place where they don't necessarily have to work with you anymore, but they still know on a daily basis what their maintenance level of food should look like meal to meal and what they need to be eating, and then go from there. Now, this doesn't mean just because there are pros and cons, this doesn't mean that people can't track long term. Some people think that the pros of doing it outweigh some of the cons and they can do it most of the time. That's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if within, on an individual level, they enjoy it. It's a net positive. It feels good. It keeps them accountable, that type of stuff. I don't see anything wrong with that. And I think the evidence and research suggests that as well. But I think for most people, that's not the goal. It's to learn about what our food is made of, to achieve a result, and then pull out some levels of control and kind of go from there. If you're a coach listening to this, it's like, well, maybe we can start to plan for that stuff as well and start to work it in terms of our coaching package, and think, hey, this is where you'll be at this point. And maybe it doesn't need to be so rigid around the exact timeline, but this is where we'll be. This is what we'll start to pull out and get you a place where we kind of like to refer to it as releasing you into the wild as a client, so that you're in a better place then, and you can hit the ground running and keep up with some of this stuff on your own. Now, that doesn't mean that people, be it they have new goals or things fall off track, that they can't go back to tracking. That isn't like, if the diet works so well in the first place, why do you have to go back to it? It's one of those things where accountability and numbers and guidance, like, they just allow you to stay back on track. And some people will just like need to have a tune up and get back to things and focus on different stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything was wrong or a failure. I think there's this negative connotation in the coaching space that when you work with someone, you need to set them up for success forever. And that doesn't really work like that. I like to think about it almost like a boiling pot on a hot stove, right? You turn your stove on, water starts boiling. If you take that pot off the stove, it's not like it forgets how to be hot. It just doesn't have the heat anymore. And coaching and systems of managing our nutrition are the exact same way. It doesn't mean that you just forget how to eat that way. It's just that there's not that same level of heat and pressure. So things kind of, can fall on the wayside, and that's just human nature, and that's okay. And it doesn't mean that people can't get back to it. So that's what I like to view, like, in terms of the life cycle of a nutrition client, and making the most of nutrition tracking at the beginning to learn more about our food and to get a result. And people don't necessarily have to be doing it forever. When they sign up for you, it's not a life sentence to be tracking your nutrition. It's using tracking as a tool to get where you're going, learn some things, and start to pull out elements of control as you get there. And we do that through introducing more mindful eating practices as we get going, start to practice them, start to put them into action, and take people to a place where they can do things that are truly sustainable long term. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that initial period or dieting, because some things aren't meant to last forever, and that's okay. But that doesn't mean that throughout that process, we can't learn the right habits, and it gives us the right opportunity to do that. And I think without the opportunity, most people don't. They really, really don't. And I think it's wishful thinking to think that they would. And that's why tracking is such an amazing, amazing tool. Hope you guys found that helpful today. If there's any questions right now as you're watching, let me know. If you're watching the replay, which I know so many of you do, I see it after I see these get hundreds of views and they continue to get searched. If you have any questions as you're listening to this, by all means, drop them in the comments. I typically get notified. I'll come back to them. I'll give you an answer, and then we'll go from there. If you're just getting started nutrition coaching and you don't necessarily know where to start, what the next step is, I have an amazing 3-day challenge, which I've dropped in the chat here. It'll also be in the description for you to get started on. It'll give you everything you need to get started nutrition coaching over 3 days, the forms, the templates, how to approach it, how to price things. It's amazing. Check it out, and I'm sure you'll benefit from it. If there's anything else, guys, let me know. And if not, I'll leave her there for today. Have a great one. Have a great weekend, and keep coming to these office hours. I like doing them, and I'm always happy to chat. Take care, guys.